There is a $6 cut of chuck sitting in a bucket in front of me right now, soaking in nothing but Dr. Pepper and a bath of teriyaki because a video going around told grown men to try this for 6 months straight. I did not wait 6 months. I did something faster and more honest, and what came out of that bucket is not what that video promised. 31 years behind a block taught me that when something sounds too easy to be true, somebody usually skipped the part that cost money. Folks have been soaking cheap meat in something acidic and fizzy since long before a camera ever showed up in a kitchen. Buttermilk, vinegar, tomato juice, even flat cola poured over a Sunday roast. That part is old and it is real. What is not real is stretching it out to half a year and calling it patience. Tonight, I am going to show you exactly what happens when you run this thing the honest way on a cut anybody can actually afford, and what that video never told you. Now, before I get into it, one thing and one time only, there is more of this than I can fit in any video. How to shop Costco without getting taken. What every cut is really worth and the words to say at the counter to get it. How to cut and prepare your own meat the way we do it behind the block. Dry aging in your own refrigerator. And every recipe I never gave out, I put all of it in a book at frankmillerbutcher.com. Link in my bio or scan the code on your screen. That is the only time you will hear me say it. Back to that bucket. The cut sitting in front of me is a chuck shoulder steak, the kind that usually gets cut thin and sold as stew meat or pushed straight through a grinder because nobody wants to pay to have it named anything nicer. $6 a pound the day I bought it, sometimes less. I picked it on purpose. A viral video does you no good if it only works on a piece of meat most of you would never buy anyway. If Dr. Pepper and teriyaki are going to work a miracle, I wanted to see it on the cheapest, honest piece of beef in the case, not on something already tender enough to not need the help. I could have run this same test on a hanger or a flat iron and gotten a prettier result, but that would have proven nothing about the cut most of you are actually standing in front of on a Tuesday. A pound of chuck sitting at $6 against a pound of ribeye sitting at 20 or more is not a small gap. Run that difference across a single week of suppers and you are looking at real money staying in your own pocket instead of crossing a counter for a name. And if a cheap marinade genuinely closes even part of that tenderness gap, that is worth testing honestly instead of dismissing on sight or swallowing whole because a video made it sound easy. Some of you already sent me the video I am talking about. Two well-known cooking men on camera, one telling the other to marinate a steak in teriyaki sauce and then Dr. Pepper, and to leave it sitting for 6 months before he ever touches a pan. 6 months. In a refrigerator, in a home kitchen, not a curing room, not a controlled cellar, just a container sitting on a shelf behind the milk. I watched that video twice before I ever said a word about it because I did not want to be the old butcher yelling at a screen without giving the thing a fair shake first. A few of the younger cooks in my own comment section told me I was being an old man about it, that 6 months was clearly a joke, part of the entertainment, and nobody watching actually planned on doing it themselves at home. Maybe that is true for most of them. It was not true for the messages I got afterward from people who told me plainly they had a container sitting in their own refrigerator right now doing exactly what that video showed. A joke only stays a joke as long as everybody watching understands the punchline, and I did not trust that everybody did. Here is where I have to stop being entertained and start being the man who spent 3 decades responsible for what left a case in good condition. 6 months is not a marinade. A marinade is measured in hours, sometimes a day or two. Once you cross into months, you are not seasoning meat anymore. You are asking raw protein to sit in liquid at refrigerator temperature for longer than any tested method has ever called safe. And the danger is not dramatic, it is quiet. It is the kind of spoilage that does not always announce itself with a smell you would notice standing over an open container in a cold kitchen. The United States Department of Agriculture has an actual number on this, and it is not 6 months. A beef steak, roast, or chop can be safely held in a marinade in the refrigerator for up to 5 days. Past that window, and often well before it, the acid in that marinade is not tenderizing the meat anymore. It is breaking the muscle down into something closer to mush, and the clock on bacterial growth keeps running the entire time, regardless of how good the smell coming off that container happens to be. 5 days is the outside edge for beef, not 5 months, not six. So before I poured a single drop into my own bucket, I made a decision the video never gave its own viewer the chance to make. I was going to run this the way an actual butcher would run it, inside a window that is genuinely safe, and let the meat tell me the truth in a couple of days instead of asking it to sit through half a calendar year on a promise. Before I get to the mechanism, I want to be fair to the video itself for one moment because not everything in it was reckless. The instinct to combine an acid with a sweet, salty sauce is not foolish. It is actually a reasonable starting point for a marinade, closer to a real technique than most of the internet gives it credit for. The mistake was never the ingredients sitting in that bucket together. The mistake was the number attached to how long they were told to stay there, and that is the one part worth separating cleanly from everything else before we go any further. Dr. Pepper itself is worth understanding before you ever pour it over anything. It came out of a drugstore in Waco, Texas back in 1885, mixed up by a pharmacist working a soda fountain who was more interested in blending flavors than curing anybody. It beat Coca-Cola to market by a year. What matters to us tonight is not the history, it is what is actually sitting inside that can. Phosphoric acid for the tang, sugar or corn syrup, depending on which version you grabbed off the shelf. For the sweetness, carbonation, which is nothing but dissolved gas looking for a way out. Every one of those three things does something to a piece of meat, and none of it is the fairy tale that video was selling. The acid is the part doing the actual work, and it is not shy about it. Phosphoric acid sits at a low pH, sharp enough to start breaking down the surface proteins on contact, which is exactly why my bucket started foaming within the first few minutes, little threads of bubbles climbing up through the meat like it was breathing. That is not the steak reacting to anything mystical. That is acid meeting muscle and protein meeting a low pH it has never had to deal with before. Same reaction you would get pouring vinegar over the same cut, just louder because of the carbonation riding along with it. So why does a plain vinegar soak sit quiet in the bucket while a soda one bubbles the second it touches the meat? Because carbonation is nothing but pressurized gas trying to find open air the moment it is disturbed, and a rough cut surface with fat seams and muscle fiber running every direction gives that gas hundreds of tiny places to escape all at once. It looks dramatic on camera. It has almost nothing to do with how well the marinade actually works underneath it. The fizz is a sideshow. The acid sitting quietly underneath that fizz is the part doing every bit of the real job. There is a detail about that particular can worth knowing before you reach for one off your own shelf. Most Dr. Pepper sold in this country today runs on high fructose corn syrup, but a smaller batch made at the original Texas bottling plant still uses real cane sugar, the way the drink was made back in 1885. Cane sugar and corn syrup behave close enough in a marinade that it will not change your result in any way you could taste blind. But it tells you something about how little the company itself worries over which version reaches your bucket, since either one gets the job of sweetening and browning done just fine once it meets a hot pan. And that is where I need to correct something before we go one more sentence, because I have watched too many home cooks assume A marinade reaches all the way through a piece of meat. If you just leave it long enough, it does not, no matter how long you leave it. Acid moves through muscle slowly, and it barely moves at all once it hits real depth. Cut open almost any marinated steak, and you will find real penetration running only a few millimeters deep, a thin ring around the outside, with the center tasting almost exactly like it would have tasted plain. 6 months does not change that mechanism. It just gives that thin outer ring more time to turn to paste while the middle of the steak sits there completely unaffected, waiting on a magic that was never coming. We are close now to what actually happened in my own bucket, but there is a piece of this puzzle sitting on the counter behind me that I have not touched yet, and it matters just as much as the steak does. My own grandfather ran meat through a buttermilk soak the same way some of you probably remember your own family doing it, and he never called it a trick, he called it Tuesday. A tough cut sitting in soured milk overnight softened up plenty on its own. No soda involved, no 6 month wait, just a mild acid and a little time doing honest work. The old ways were never wrong about the principle. Acid softens the outside of tough meat. What they never did, not once, not in any kitchen I ever stood in, was leave a piece of raw meat sitting in that acid for half a year and call the result improved instead of ruined. Cola over meat is not even new the way the video made it sound. A cola glazed ham has been sitting on southern tables for longer than most of us have been alive. Brown sugar and mustard and a can of cola poured right over the top before it goes into the oven. But look closely at that recipe and you will notice it is finished, not raw, and it is glazed for an hour or two in real heat, not left sitting cold and uncooked for a season. The cola in that recipe is doing a caramelizing job on an already cooked surface, not a tenderizing job on raw muscle sitting in a bucket. Two completely different jobs wearing the same can. The man who trained me used to say the fastest way to ruin a good piece of meat was to trust an idea longer than the meat could actually survive it. And I think about that sentence every time I watch somebody online stretch a reasonable technique past the point where it stops helping. He was not against trying new things. He tried 48 hours, sits comfortably inside what the USDA actually calls safe, and it is long enough for a real reaction to show up on a chuck steak this size. What I pulled out did not look like the steak that went in. The surface had gone pale and slightly opaque in places, almost the way a piece of fish looks after it has spent time in citrus, which tells you plainly that the acid had done exactly what acid does. It had cooked that outer layer without any heat at all. Underneath that thin, pale ring, the meat was still raw, still red, still every bit the chuck steak it started as. Why does an acid marinade turn a raw surface pale and slightly opaque instead of leaving it looking raw the whole way through? Because acid does to protein almost exactly what heat does, just slower and without any actual cooking involved. It unfolds the protein strands sitting near the surface and lets them clump back together in a different shape, which is the same reaction that turns a piece of raw fish opaque and firm when you make ceviche in nothing but lime juice. Your eyes are reading that outer layer as cooked because in every way that matters to the protein itself, it effectively is, even though no heat ever touched it. The smell surprised me more than the look did. There was a real sweetness sitting on top of the meat smell, something close to a barbecue glaze that had not been anywhere near heat yet. And underneath that, the teriyaki had left its own note of soy and a little char from the sugar starting to caramelize right there in the liquid without ever touching a flame. None of that is dangerous. That part of the video was not lying to you. Sugar caramelizes at a lower point than most people think, and sitting inside an acidic bath for 2 full days is more than enough time for a small amount of that reaction to start happening on its own. Here is the part where I have to be honest with you, the way I would be honest with a customer standing at my own counter asking whether something is worth the money. 48 hours in that bucket did soften the outer half inch of that chuck steak in a real measurable way. I could press a thumb into it and feel less resistance than I would feel on the same cut left plain. The center of the steak told a completely different story. Press into the middle, and it felt exactly like an untouched chuck steak because it was one still waiting for either more time it should never legally have or a proper cooking method to finish the job the acid was never going to reach on its own. That is the piece the viral video skipped past entirely, and it is the piece that actually matters to your own kitchen. A marinade like this one is a surface treatment. It is never a whole steak treatment, no matter how many months you are willing to hand it. If you want the center of a tough cut to actually eat tender, acid sitting in a bucket was never going to get you there by itself. You need low, slow heat working alongside it, breaking down the connective tissue, running through the middle of that muscle the way only real cooking time can do. I want to stop here for a moment on something that has nothing to do with soda at all. A dollar figure sitting on a package does not tell you one thing about how a piece of meat is going to eat. It only tells you what somebody decided to name it. That chuck steak sitting in my bucket came off the same animal as a ribeye, just a few inches further along the muscle, and the only real difference between the two of them at the register is where a saw happened to land that particular morning. $6 against 20, sometimes more, for meat that started on the very same steer. I have cut that exact steer apart more times than I could count for you honestly, and I can tell you plainly there was never a meeting where anybody decided to punish the chuck and reward the loin. It is quieter than that. A cutter under a clock has seconds to decide what gets a name and what gets pushed through with everything else, and the pieces that take a moment too long to sort get pushed through more often than they should. That arithmetic has been running in the back of every meat department in this country for longer than there have been clocks hanging on the wall back there to watch it happen. Now, back to that bucket, because there is still more of this experiment worth your attention before we get to the actual verdict. I ran a second piece of the same chuck steak for 24 hours instead of 48, sitting right beside the first one so I could compare them fairly. And the difference between the two told me almost everything I needed to know about where the real value in this whole method sits. At 24 hours, the surface had barely started to change, a light softening you could feel but barely see. At 48 hours, that same surface had gone further than I actually wanted it to, edging toward the mushy texture the USDA warns you about once an acid marinade runs too long. And this was still nowhere near 6 months. This was 2 honest days. That told me something important. The window where this method actually helps a cheap cut is narrow, somewhere between 1 day and 2, and it closes faster than most home cooks would ever guess sitting at their own kitchen counter reading a recipe card. Past that window, you are not improving the steak anymore. You are quietly damaging it 1 hour at a time, and nothing about the smell or the color warns you plainly enough to notice while it is happening. I went one step further and ran a third piece all the way out to 5 days, because 5 days is the actual outside edge the United States Department of Agriculture allows for a beef marinade, and I wanted to see that edge with my own eyes instead of trusting a number off a page. By day 5, the outer inch of that steak had gone soft in a way that had nothing appealing about it, closer to the texture of canned meat than anything you would want to serve at your own table, and the smell had shifted from that early sweetness into something flatter and less pleasant, not spoiled exactly, but nowhere near the honest smell it started with. That is the government's own maximum, reached and used up entirely, and it already looked worse than what I pulled at 48 hours. 6 months was never on the table as anything but a mistake wearing a patient man's name. I cooked both pieces the same way, hot cast iron, real heat, finished with a little of the marinade reduced down separate in a pan because you can never trust marinade that touched raw meat straight off the counter without boiling it first. The 24-hour piece held its shape and browned the way a properly dried steak should. The 48-hour piece browned slower and patchier because that softened outer layer was carrying more moisture than a dry surface ever should, fighting the pan instead of meeting it the way a properly salted, properly dried steak always will. Taste told the real story once both were rested and sliced. The 24-hour piece ate like a genuinely improved chuck steak, tender through that outer half inch, honest chuck flavor still coming through the middle, with a background sweetness from the Dr. Pepper that reminded me more of a barbecue glaze than anything you would call a marinade in a classic sense. The 48-hour piece ate soft in a way that was not entirely pleasant, closer to that mushy texture people describe when a marinade has genuinely gone too long, with the sweetness starting to taste less like flavor and more like something fighting the beef instead of complementing it. Neither piece at any point tasted like it needed 6 months to get there, and the 5-day piece proved that plainly by tasting worse than the 2-day one, despite sitting for over twice as long. More time was never the missing ingredient, restraint was. Step back from the chemistry for a second, and this whole thing lines up with everything I already told you about that chuck steak's price. A cut sitting at $6 a pound is cheap because a saw drew a line on a carcass, not because the muscle itself is inferior. And a short, honest marinade is one of the real tools that closes part of the gap between that cheap cut and the name cut sitting a few feet over in the same case. Stretch that same tool out past where it actually works, and you have not found a shortcut. You have thrown away the very meat you were trying to save money on in the first place, which is a worse outcome than simply paying for the ribeye and never touching a bucket at all. That is the honest verdict sitting underneath everything I just walked you through. A short soak in an acidic sweet marinade like this one can genuinely help a cheap cut of chuck the same way buttermilk or vinegar always could. And it works inside a single day, not a season. Stretching that same idea out to half a year does not multiply the benefit, it multiplies the risk. And past a certain point, it does not even multiply the flavor, it just starts erasing it. I want to give you the piece of this that actually belongs in your own kitchen because that is worth more than the experiment itself. If you want to try a version of this at home, start with a real marinade window, 12 to 24 hours in the refrigerator, never on a counter. Use a genuine teriyaki, real soy, and real sugar, not a bottled version loaded with thickener, and cut it with something acidic like Dr. Pepper or even a plain cola if that is what is sitting in your own refrigerator already. Pat the surface dry before it ever meets a hot pan. The same rule that holds true on every single steak I have ever cooked, because a wet surface fights heat instead of meeting it. And boil any leftover marinade before you ever think about pouring it back over cooked meat, because raw beef sat in that liquid the entire time you were waiting. This method earns its keep the most on the cuts that need it most: chuck, bottom round, a tougher shoulder piece, anything already carrying enough connective tissue that a little surface softening actually moves the needle on how it eats. Run the same soak on a fillet or a ribeye, and you are not improving anything. You are just adding sweetness to a piece of meat that never asked for the help in the first place. And do not carry any of these same numbers over to chicken. Poultry runs on a shorter safe window than beef does, closer to 2 days at the outside rather than 5, because the bacteria that favor raw poultry grow on a faster clock than the ones sitting on a piece of beef. There is one more thing worth saying plainly before we close this out, because I do not want you walking away thinking a soda marinade is some kind of secret weapon nobody in the trade ever talks about. It is a mild acid treatment, no different in principle from vinegar, buttermilk, or tomato juice, wearing a more interesting name because it came out of a can instead of a jug. The trick was never the drink. The trick, if there is one at all, is understanding that acid works on the surface. Sugar caramelizes on contact with heat, and time past a couple of days stops helping and starts hurting, no matter how patient the video sitting in your recommended feed made that patient sound. Some of you are going to say this whole thing is nothing but a gimmick dressed up with a soda can for the thumbnail, and I understand exactly why it looks that way at a glance. But the acid, the sugar, and the surface reaction I showed you tonight are real chemistry, the same chemistry sitting under a vinegar marinade your own grandmother used, just wearing a modern label. The gimmick was never the mechanism. The gimmick was the 6 months. Some of you are going to say a butcher has no business telling anybody what a viral video got wrong. And to that one, I will only say I spent 31 years standing behind a case, watching what actually happens to meat left too long in the wrong conditions. And I would rather tell you the honest window now than watch you find out the hard way with a container that has been sitting behind your milk since spring. And some of you are going to say, I only ran this test because I knew it would prove me right. I did not know that going in. I have been wrong about plenty of old habits before, and science has occasionally handed me back an answer I did not expect. This time, the honest window turned out to be shorter than a viral video and longer than nothing at all, and I would have told you that either way it landed. My own hands do not hold a knife as steady as they used to, and there is a stiffness in my right shoulder most mornings that tells me plainly I am not standing behind a working block anymore. I do not tell you that looking for sympathy. I tell you because 31 years of paying close attention to what actually happens to meat instead of what a label or a viral video claims happens to it is the only thing left in these hands worth handing over to somebody else. A test like the one you watched tonight costs me almost nothing now. It used to cost customers real money whenever a shortcut got sold to them as a secret. Let me be plain about the money sitting underneath all of this because that matters as much as the chemistry does. A chuck steak at $6 a pound, run through a proper 24-hour soak like the one I showed you tonight, gets you most of the tenderness improvement people are chasing from a viral video at a fraction of the price of the cut that never needed the help in the first place. Do that once a week instead of reaching for a name cut every time, and the difference sitting in your own pocket by the end of a year is real money, not a rounding error. 20 or so dollars saved on a single supper does not sound like much sitting by itself, but multiplied across 52 weeks, it is closer to a full month of groceries handed back to you for nothing more than patience and an honest marinade. If you remember 3 things out of everything I walked you through tonight, remember that acid only ever reaches the outer half inch of a piece of meat no matter how long you wait. Remember that the USDA draws the line at 5 days for a beef marinade and not 1 day past it. And remember that a short, honest soak beats a long, dangerous one every single time on a piece of meat like this. So here is your homework this week, 3 short lines and nothing more. Pick up an honest chuck cut instead of reaching for the name cut sitting at eye level. Run it through a real marinade, acid, and sweetness together for 1 day and never longer than 2. And pat it bone dry before it ever meets a hot pan. The same rule that has never once let me down in 31 years of cooking meat for a living. Do not try to shortcut the shortcut either. I have seen people online suggest speeding the whole thing up further with a vacuum sealer or a needle to force the marinade deeper into the muscle faster, and I understand the instinct, but forcing liquid past the surface changes the food safety picture entirely. since you are now carrying whatever is riding in that marinade down into the middle of the meat instead of leaving it sitting on the outside where a normal cooking temperature can reach it easily. Treat any cut like that the same careful way you would treat a blade tenderized steak, cooked through properly rather than left rare, because the surface is no longer the only place that matters once something has punched a path to the center. Come back down to the comments and tell me two things. Tell me where you are watching this from, and tell me whether you have ever tried a soda marinade yourself and how long you actually left it in there. I read every single one of them myself. Next time, I want to open up the whole question of dry brining against wet marinades side by side on the same cut, cooked the same way, because there is a mistake almost everybody makes mixing those two methods together without knowing it, and I will show you exactly what that mistake looks like before I show you anything else. If you got something useful out of this one, subscribe and the next one will find you on its own. Buy the working muscle, cook it slow, cut it thin. If you enjoyed this video, I am sure you will love the next one.